You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 21st of August 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Barack Obama remembers how much he enjoyed making fun of Donald Trump on stage, Italy's Prime Minister picks a fight with one of Italy's best-known brands, and Switzerland's plan to combine disinformation studies with scenery. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Charles Hecker and Marta Lorimer will discuss today's big stories, and our On This Day historical series will pay tribute to the art thief who bit off rather more than he could chew. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Charles Hecker, Senior Partner at Control Risks, and by Marta Lorimer, Lecturer in Politics at Cardiff University. Hello to you both.
Good evening.
Hello.
Marta, first of all, you have recently been to Dublin, which is always a worthwhile endeavour in itself, but you went old school.
Yes, I went very old school. I bought the train plus ferry ticket. So instead of taking about 2 hours, it took me 9 hours. But the scenery, wonderful.
Why did you do this? Was this environmental consciousness, a dislike of flying, or are you just really into trains and ferries?
All of the above. I don't really like flying. I quite like slow travel, and it is a more environmentally conscious solution. So if I can do the environmentally conscious option, I will do it.
I did many years ago do the ferry crossing to Dunleary from Holyhead a couple of times. I have a recollection of winning 20 quid on the quiz machine, which they did have installed at the time, probably don't anymore. Did you get the impression that many other people were doing it, or was it mostly people who were just going to Ireland from Wales or who wanted to bring their car, or...?
There were quite a few people on the train because the train manager actually said at one point, we know that we are delayed and we will be getting in touch with the people at the ferry.
That goes without saying on a British train.
It is a British train. But there were quite a few people who were doing this as well and who came in. I think not a lot from London, but quite a few people did join along the way and were just taking the ferry.
Charles, by way of foreshadowing a story we will be addressing later in the show, you have recently been on Swiss trains which do leave on time.
Yeah, exactly. You'd better not be late in turning up to any of Switzerland's train stations, because the air-conditioned, quiet, comfortable, smooth trains will arrive and depart exactly as promised. So much so that we've seen stories recently about how Switzerland is banning the entry of German trains onto its territory because German trains arrive so late into Switzerland that they mess up the Swiss train schedule. So,
do you think Germans have just got sick of the stereotype and they've just decided to have a bit of fun with it?
Well, the stereotype is sort of crumbling as we speak. This idea of Germany being technologically advanced and sort of die-cast precise in everything it does is really a myth, and Switzerland is doing everything it can to stick a pin into that bubble.
Well, sticking with the theme of countries with crumbling railway infrastructure, we go first to the United States, specifically Chicago. That was seamless, where the Democratic National Convention is ongoing. We will have analysis from our panellists presently, but first this. Amid the balloon streamers, flags, confetti and general delirious ululating that goes on at these things, reporter Simon Marks spoke to Eleni Kounalakis, Lieutenant Governor of California.
California knows her. We know her background professionally. She is a prosecutor, and she is going to prosecute the case against Donald Trump, who has made history as the only convicted felon who has also been president of the United States. So that is really going to be central, I think, in the campaign as well. Of course, is the fact that she believes in American democracy. She came up through it in her life service. And of course, he said he wants to be a dictator on day one.
People watching this convention from the Asia-Pacific region 5 weeks ago were watching the RNC in Milwaukee, where they heard J.D. Vance echoing Donald Trump's argument that countries that have taken advantage of the generosity of the United States in terms of military protection, military umbrella, should be prepared to pay for that military security. What's the message from this convention to countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, about the health of the relationship, the bilateral relationships, in a future Democrat administration led by Kamala Harris?
Well, I was in the Obama administration as the United States ambassador in Hungary, and the president has been the greatest role model to the vice president in terms of foreign policy, and it's clear that we see the importance of our alliances and that our alliances are not transactional. They are values-based alliances, and that is something that she knows and she believes in. Her advisors, people like Phil Gordon, who've been with her for a long time, that is just true, that these alliances are values-based, and that goes for our NATO alliances, our relationship, as you mentioned, with Japan, with New Zealand and Australia, with Korea, all of the work to be able to find those areas where we agree and build our relationships and our ability to work together around those values. And I think she will continue to operate in that sphere. So it's not just human rights, it's also trade. And we know, frankly, that the Asia-Pacific region was important, with the pivot to Asia, starting with Obama. This is very important to the United States. And I can tell you, as the Lieutenant Governor of California, which has 500 miles of frontage on the Pacific Rim, we know how important the region is. Stability and fairness, healthy trade relationships, and of course, never letting our foot off the gas when it comes to promoting human rights and just the basic values that we have of human rights in the world.
And can I push you on the issue of trade? Because this is clearly, in Washington, D.C. at the moment, a protectionist era. There are many countries in the region that want more opportunities to engage in freer trade with the United States. Do they get more of that under Kamala Harris than they've got under Joe Biden?
Well, I'll push back a little bit on the notion that it's protectionism. I do think that the United States has been historically now the leader in free trade in the world. At the same time, we have to recognize that there are certain things that for our own security we need to be manufacturing and prioritizing here in the United States. That's what the CHIPS Act was all about. That is what the IRA is also about. And the kinds of partnerships that we have, with Mexico and with Asia, these trade relationships are very, very robust, but fine-tuning them to make sure that we are onshoring strategically is something that's just important and should be a priority.
Can I ask you finally about the party's platform, particularly with reference to the protests that have been taking place on the fringes and on the perimeter of this convention? The protesters are obviously calling for a shift in policy on the Middle East, but they're also pointing to the fact that the platform is Joe Biden's platform that Kamala Harris is essentially inheriting. How much of the platform needs to change and should be changed before Election Day in order better to reflect her priorities, particularly on the Middle East in terms of those protests, but on other issues as well?
I think we saw last night President Biden is very much in the driver's seat on U.S. foreign policy and will be for the next 5 months. The administration, his administration, the vice president, certainly respects his leadership, and a lot is going to happen between now and when President Harris, if we are so fortunate that we win this, will be doing. A lot's going to happen between now and then, and I think that what we've seen from the president's leadership is a real recognition of the pain and suffering in Gaza, the United States providing so much in terms of international aid and support, and leadership in the diplomatic space to bring the hostages home, to recognize that Israel is our friend and our ally and our partner and has a right to protect itself, but that it is time for a ceasefire. It is time for the parties to come together, dial this down, because too many innocent people have lost their lives. There is too much suffering, and it is time for a ceasefire and to end this horrible war.
That was Eleni Kounalakis, Lieutenant Governor of California, speaking to Simon Marks. Charles, Simon there was actually attempting to engage the Lieutenant Governor in a discussion of policy, which is not something we've heard a great deal of at this convention so far. Should we, do you think, or is that not really the point of this exercise?
It's not the point of this exercise at all. These sorts of scripted events, and the lieutenant governor of California did a very good job of sticking to her talking points and sticking to things that have been prescribed to her by the party to say, long gone are the days when Republican or Democratic conventions were spontaneous political moments that literally sort of elected their presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate from a divided and contentious floor. And actually what's interesting is, as scripted as the events are in Chicago over the past couple and the next 2 days, it was only a matter of a few weeks ago that there was some concern that this whole thing would be thrown wide open and there would be what's called a brokered convention. So what a difference a few weeks makes. But the Harris campaign has been accused of being a little bit light on policy. The vice president will have to come forth with that and populate, at the very least, her campaign speech and her campaign website with more details and more meat on the bones. But for the time being, over the next couple of days, this is fanfare. This is a sort of evangelical tent meeting, and everyone's just waiting for the balloon drop.
Well, the headliners last night were both Obamas. Here is some of what the former president had to say.
The next president of the United States of America, Kamala Harris. History will remember Joe Biden as an outstanding president who defended democracy at a moment of great danger. And then there's Donald Trump. Don't boo, vote. Here's a 78-year-old billionaire who has not stopped whining about his problems since he rode down his golden escalator 9 years ago.
President Barack Obama speaking last night at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Marta, Barack Obama has never been shy about ridiculing Donald Trump. There is, in fact, a theory which holds the reason Donald Trump ran for president in the first place was because Obama made fun of him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. But there is nevertheless a change in tack, I think, discernible in the Democrats, that rather than invoking Trump as this bogeyman, this thing to be feared, they have just started pointing and laughing. Do you think it's working?
I think it makes sense as a strategy to point out that he is weird, I believe were the words of Walz. It is one way to deal with someone like Donald Trump. Donald Trump doesn't handle ridicule particularly well, whereas he might be able to actually enjoy being looked at as a threat of some kind. The moment you actually start making fun of him, you point out, well, look, Joe Biden had to retire because he was too old. But, Donald Trump isn't quite as sharp as he used to be. That might be a more effective tactic. And we also saw it in Michelle Obama's speech that they are starting to go low where others go low as well.
We also heard last night, Charles, from Trump's former press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, who appears to have had a bit of a rethink of her views of her former boss. And what she said certainly confirms what I have heard from people I have asked who were in the room while Trump was attempting to do president stuff. But does that convince... I mean, obviously everything she had to say was deliriously lapped up by that audience, but will any of that have registered at all, do you think, with any Trump voters or any swing voters, if indeed such a thing exists, which I for one doubt?
Well, so this is what some of the sort of dissenting Republican voices are designed to do at the Democratic convention. And that is, remember that winning this election is down to swaying a very, very, very small number of voters. And so anyone that the Democrats can sort of pull over from the Republican side to the Democrat side, or any undecided minds that they can help decide, is the goal. The problem is that, speakers like Stephanie Grisham and people who have undergone these great conversions once they're out of power are treated, number one, with a certain amount of skepticism. Number two, they will be absolutely vilified and hung out to dry by MAGA Republicans, and not just Stephanie Grisham, but any of the people who have made these last-minute conversions to the Democratic cause, and there's a growing number of them. And so I think there's a tiny grain of salt applied because when they were in power, they loved it. Now that it's easier for them out of power to criticize the previous administration, they're doing it. But they will, the Democrats are more than happy to have defectors and will deploy them to maximum effect.
Well, we will have more on the DNC across all our shows tomorrow. Among the speakers for later tonight are Governor Tim Walz, now the vice presidential nominee, and former President Bill Clinton, still incredibly 3 years younger than Joe Biden. But we will look now at Ukraine and Russia, whom, if the accounts of both are to be believed, already are conducting a territory exchange of a sort. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine says Ukraine's expeditionary forces in Kursk Oblast are fortifying what they hold and pressing further on. Ukraine has also launched its largest drone attack yet against Moscow. Russia, meanwhile, claims that its troops have taken New York, not that one, but the hamlet of that name in Donetsk Oblast, a possible way station en route to the bigger towns of Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Marta, first of all, the point of the Kursk incursion, so far as it's been understood, was that it was to draw Russian troops away from Donbass, which so far at least does not appear to be occurring.
Well, there are a variety of reasons why this incursion might be happening. One of them is indeed to try and move Russia and break up the front a little bit more. But I also get the feeling that part of the reason why you have to at some point make a move is to avoid this becoming a frozen conflict. And so a relatively good strategy to do that is to actually make an incursion of sorts so that you don't end up in a situation where you're basically Transnistria.
Is there a problem, though, Charles, potentially between seizing your opponent's territory, launching drone raids on its cities, that for Ukraine, which has commanded, I think, in the eyes of most observers, at least, the moral high ground for 2.5 years, that you start to perhaps cede some of that, especially if there are civilian casualties, which are increasingly inevitable the more of this sort of thing you do?
Yeah, the invasion of the Kursk Oblast has really injected an interesting new dynamic into the conflict. And I think the expectation was that this would open up the new front and that this would be Ukraine trying to hold on to the progress that it's made in Kursk and Russia regrouping to try to take it back. That hasn't happened. Instead, Russia responded with a fusillade on Kiev in the very few days after the seizing of territory in Kursk, and then Kiev just this morning launching drones on Moscow. And then Ukraine actually losing quite a bit of territory already in Donbass. And so where we expected aggravated conflict, we didn't see it. Where we thought there would be stasis, we saw aggravated conflict. I think that what Ukraine is doing is storing up not military ammunition, but sort of negotiating ammunition for the future, because if they can hold Kursk, and that's a big if, then they now have territory to negotiate if talks ever turn to a property swap.
Marta, are you surprised by how relatively little attendant flap there has been over the incursion into Kursk Oblast? Because you don't have to think back too far to remember Ukraine's allies having absolute vapours at the thought of equipping them with anything more potent than pea shooters, and now they are using NATO-supplied kit to actually seize Russian territory. And Russia itself, meanwhile, is not threatening to reduce Kyiv to rubble. It is not threatening horrendous annihilation of Ukraine's allies. Russia seems to be trying to project an air of no big deal about this whole thing.
It's the summer, isn't it? I think that's not. I'm not going to say it's part of the explanation, but I probably suspect that one of the reasons we're not hearing quite as much about it is because it is the summer. People are busy in other things. The other thing is that this is a conflict that at this point has been going on for a very long time. And so I think there's also a measure of rethinking what you want the narrative for the next few years to be. So if Russia overreacts, basically what they're saying is that they're genuinely worried. Whereas if they're playing it down and saying, no, everything is fine, we're going to be in this for a very long time and we're ready for it, then they're really sending a different message. They're giving you the idea that they're in this for the long run.
Charles, drawing back a bit, and this is where you will be able to weave in a seamless mention of your imminent book pertaining to Russia and the economy. Russia has been under sanctions, allegedly severe ones, for 2.5 years now. And again, thinking back to the early application of those sanctions, there were people that were confidently predicting that Russia would be reduced to something akin to the United States circa 1932 within a matter of weeks. Not only has that not happened, Russia's economy is by some measures absolutely booming. Why is that?
That's right. But yes, there might be somebody in the studio who's releasing a book in a couple of months on the arc of international business in Russia, but we'll leave it to the listeners to discover who that person is.
Does it have a title, Charles?
Yes, it's called Zero Sum. and we'll leave it to the readers to determine who in the studio might be the person writing that book. But thank you, Andrew. Forecasts.
Always a pleasure, Charles.
Forecasts of the Russian economy are widely varied, and it depends in part on your political perspective, and it depends in part on how much wishful thinking you want to incorporate into your forecasts. But if you take a fairly realistic view, Russian GDP is outperforming almost all expectations. The question is how long that outperformance will last. The Russian government is spending lavishly on social costs and also, of course, on military hardware, and that is boosting the Russian economy. That can only last for so long. But the other thing that is frustrating and puzzling at the same time is the trajectory of sanctions. And that is Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world, more than North Korea, more than Iran, and its economy is growing at the same time. And it's puzzling because I wonder how much policymakers failed to anticipate the elaborate amount of sanctions workarounds that are available to Russia and that are fueling the Russian economy, and how difficult it's been to crack down on those workarounds. And so while Russia is the world's most sanctioned country, sanctions aren't biting quite as hard yet, and I insert that word intentionally, as we anticipated.
Well, it is a stock promise of the populist on the make in wealthy democracies that they will bring back the jobs, typically the manufacturing jobs, which have been shipped overseas by companies who have gone where the workers are cheaper, the labour laws less stringent, the trade unionists in prison, and so forth. Difficulties tend to arise with this, as with other populist promises, when they attempt to deliver on them. As Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has discovered, appeals to patriotism tend not to impress the CEOs of multinationals. She is nevertheless going in swinging at car manufacturing behemoth Stellantis, owner of, among others, the Italian marques Alfa Romeo, Maserati, Lancia and Fiat. Stellantis, Marta, was created a few years back when Fiat merged with PSA Peugeot. She wants them to invest more in Italy, which is a reasonable desire for the Prime Minister of Italy, that Fiat should spend more money in Italy. But is there any reason why Stellantis should?
Not particularly from their perspective, right?
This is the problem.
I was going to say, this is a business. They follow their own commercial logics, and if Giorgia Meloni has a problem with capitalism, then she should pick the bone with capitalism itself as a system, right? Which she's not going to do. I think this is an interesting moment where we can really see what Meloni is up to as a politician. As a politician of the radical right, her big thing is going to be that she has to defend the national interest. And going after companies that are Italian but are not investing in Italy is one fairly obvious way to do so, because she can show, look, not only do I care about the national interest, I care about protecting made in Italy, and I care about your jobs. So this is precisely the kind of relatively easy vote-winning issue that she can go after.
I mean, anybody can care about something, of course, Charles. It's actually being able to get anything done about it, which tends to be the tricky bit. But she is she just appealing to sentiment, though? Because another case that she has made is that Stellantis is registered in the Netherlands, whereas for years and years, decades and decades, the Italian state subsidised Fiat colossally.
Yeah, Marta and I were talking about this in the green room prior to coming into the studio, and I find it difficult to imagine that a prime minister of a G7 country within the European Union and within an increasingly globalized world, within reason, is having difficulty understanding that Italian manufacturers are making Italian things, or things that sort of look and sound Italian, in places like Poland or otherwise outside of Italy. Moreover, Meloni is walking a very fine line in saying what she's saying about production in Italy while also trying to attract Chinese business into Italy. And so how do you sort of do Italy for Italians or Italian jobs for Italian workers? And as she is actively doing right now, courting Chinese businesses. So I find this a little bit surprising. And why not, at a time like this, have the Italian flag stuck on the side of as many products as possible, no matter where they're built?
Well, Marta, she has been unhappy about literally that. She has insisted that the Italian flag decal be taken off cars made in Morocco. She stopped Alfa Romeo from calling a car that was being made in Poland the Milano. Do gestures like that register with any voters at all, or do they just rather tend to end up demonstrating how impotent the politician making them is?
It depends on the voter. I suspect if you are your traditional Meloni voter who genuinely cares about the government, and this is probably the kind of voter that she's trying to appeal to and to show that, I am keeping my word. I told you this was what I was going to do, and I am doing it, and I'm doing my best. I think whoever doesn't really like Meloni is going to be saying, well, look, you actually have much bigger issues to deal with. Why is it that you are picking a fight over a car made in Poland but called Milano?
I mean, if Alfa Romeo had a sense of humour, of course, they would have renamed it the Georgia or the Meloni. They didn't. They called it the Junior, which sounds a bit like Georgia, but I think that's wishful thinking on my part. But I'll put a version of the same question to you, Charles, because you can frame a similar thing here in the United Kingdom. Rolls-Royce Motor Cars is owned by BMW. Bentley is owned by Volkswagen. Jaguar is owned by Tata. Do you get the sense that actual real people care about this? Is this some ghastly suppurating psychic wound or just something that populist headbangers enjoy making a thing of?
I think it's probably the second. It's the latter more than the former. I think this is something that people care about on an emotional level, and it's sort of flag and country and some idea of, particularly with sort of loud, crunchy names like Rolls-Royce or Bentley. And I think that this represents in the public imagination some sort of idea about what's supposed to be British and what happens if it's not. Beyond that, I don't really think that it cuts through, and I don't think that there's a lot of traction. If you are working in a Rolls-Royce factory or a Bentley factory in the UK and your bosses are German or Italian, yeah, it may register with you, but the most important thing is that you have a job.
Well, listeners of a certain age may recall sneering at and or signing up for media studies classes as a DOS option, a subject in which you were guaranteed at least a B+ even if you slept through every class, not least as the teacher usually did. In the online epoch, it is arguable that there is no subject more important. We broadcast from a country very recently gripped by riots sparked by entirely bogus social media gossip. Switzerland has an idea. SBB's School and Discovery train, which has offered rolling classrooms since 2003, is to add a coach which will instruct students in discerning fake news from verifiable reality. We were discussing earlier, Marta, you are a fan of train travel, of slow travel, of working while moving. Would you be into the idea of learning specifically about fake news while travelling?
Why not? I learned so much reading conference papers on my train to Dublin, and it would have only been enhanced by knowing that I would get to my destination on time.
Charles, you outed yourself at the top of the show as a fan of Swiss trains, which, to be honest, is not a controversial position to take. But do you think children really need more encouragement to stare out of the window during class?
Staring out of the window in class, if you're in a Swiss train, is very, very tempting. But we're talking about social media, we're talking about phones, we're talking about laptops, we're talking about tablets, and kids like devices. And I think what the Swiss are probably trying to do is combine this new media and these shiny surfaces that attract younger eyeballs. But while they're there, try to teach them a lesson. And the Swiss may be taking a page from a lot of other governments around Europe, in particular the Finns, who are also at a fairly young age in their school system introducing sort of critical media studies and teaching young users of social media to look at that material with a slightly more critical eye. And in a world of hybrid warfare, preparing your citizenship with the sort of critical skills that they require to understand what is static and what is meaningful, or what is outright disinformation, let alone static, and doing it while you're rolling through the beautiful Swiss countryside. I wish my classrooms were that nice.
Marta, how does any country, though, whether they're doing this on trains or in classrooms, get past the difficulty that, and it's a variation of the difficulty that you often run into if you work for what is derided as the legacy or mainstream media and you try to tackle disinformation or conspiracy theory, you get the response, well, you would say that. You're in on it.
This is why you have to get them while they're young. You have to I think that the idea of teaching students, and particularly younger students, to engage critically with material is really quite important, because that's probably an age where you can still persuade them to actually do that. But yes, you do have to get them while they're young, because past a certain age, nothing is going to go in.
My own potted theory, though, Charles, is that I'm not sure it's the young people who most urgently need the lessons in discerning online disinformation.
Completely agree. But for the rest of us, for all of us whose circuits are fairly hardened when it comes to this sort of behavior, it's going to be harder to move any of us off of our beliefs and off of our stance and the way we filter and interpret and emit information. And again, just as Marta said, I think with younger kids, if you inject this if you empower them to make their own decisions about what they consume and how they consume it, this is the time for the rest of us. Yeah, the ship has sailed. It's way too late.
Charles Hecker and Marta Lorimer, thanks for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical series recalls a crime all at once, one of the most audacious and least perspicacious ever committed. The thing about art theft is that it actually pays to think small.
Huh?
Or if not small exactly, then not ostentatiously big. Supposing you do make off with a well-known painting, like one of the classics of that strata which would be recognised at a glance by the most obdurate Philistine, what are you going to do with it? You can't very well exhibit it, and you can only sell it if you find someone who is both rich enough to afford it and mad enough to take such a risk with no imaginable reward beyond a furtive personal satisfaction. Were you to hang Van Gogh's The Starry Night or Botticelli's Birth of Venus in your billiard room, questions might well be asked. None of which seems to have occurred to an Italian handyman called Vincenzo Peruggia, who on August 21st, 1911, stole the most famous painting of all. The Mona Lisa, painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the early years of the 16th century, had hung in the Louvre Museum in Paris since 1797. Give or take a brief stint in the early 19th century, gazing inscrutably upon the bedroom of Napoleon, and a brief relocation for safekeeping to the arsenal at Brest during the Franco-Prussian dust-up of the early 1870s. In fairness to Vincenzo Peruggia, by 1911 the Mona Lisa hadn't quite acquired the ubiquitous kitsch cachet it enjoys today. It appeared on no t-shirts, fridge magnets or drinks coasters, was not perpetually besieged by tourists taking photos of it, so that they might rivet their friends and relatives back home with their pictures.
Wow, is that what the Mona Lisa looks like? I'll be damned.
But it was still a Da Vinci, and therefore a pretty big whoop. It is not clear precisely when Peruggia decided to filch it. He'd worked at the Louvre a few years by the time of the theft, doing odd jobs including building secure fittings for precious works. And on this day, 113 years ago, he removed the Mona Lisa from its case, wrapped it up in a smock, it's painted on wood so could not be rolled up, tucked it under one arm, walked out of the building and hailed a cab.
Taxi, ici, s'il vous plaît.
Once home, he stashed the Mona Lisa in his apartment. Gendarmes who visited to question him left with no idea of how close they'd come, but they had no idea generally. In one farcical subplot, Pablo Picasso ended up in court along with a couple of associates who did have form for nicking minor items from the Louvre. Security was not what it now is, but the charges were thrown out, as were the defendants, by a judge wearied of their general bohemian histrionics. As the search continued, France was aghast. One journal of the day vapouring,
"What audacious criminal, what mystifier, what maniac collector, what insane lover has committed this abduction?"
Perugia kept the Mona Lisa in his apartment for 2 years, which he seems to have calculated was long enough for everyone to forget about it. It was not. In 1913, he contacted a Florence art dealer, Alfredo Geri, with a view to selling it. Geri played along, lured Perugia to Florence with the painting, and having verified it, summoned Plod. In court, Perugia floated the line that he was a patriot outraged, that he had no motive more venal than returning to Italy, what was rightfully Italy's. Among Italy's public, there was considerable sympathy for the notion that the Mona Lisa had been cruelly looted by Napoleon, though it wasn't. King Francis I had bought it fair and square from Da Vinci for 4,000 gold ducats more than 200 years before Napoleon's birth. Possibly in recognition of the folk hero status Perugia had acquired, he was sentenced to a mere year and 10 days, reduced to 8 months thanks partly to a psychiatrist who testified that he was, quote, intellectually deficient. The painting, meanwhile, was sent on tour around Italy before being returned to France with the somewhat lachrymose blessings of Italy's education minister, Luigi Credaro.
Although the masterpiece is dear to all Italians as one of the best productions of the genius of their race, we will willingly return it to its foster country as a pledge of friendship and brotherhood between the two great Latin nations. The Mona Lisa will be delivered to the French ambassador with a solemnity worthy of Leonardo da Vinci and a spirit of happiness worthy of Mona Lisa's smile.
Righto, settle down. To this day, 113 years later, nobody really knows whether Vincenzo Perugia had been playing a very long game, was seized by sudden avaricious whim, or, as has been suggested, was expressing a long simmering grudge against his French colleagues, who taunted him as macaroni. Perhaps Perugia believed removing their Italian masterpiece a superior rebuke to mocking their weird culinary proclivity towards gastropods. Or he may, as his own defence intimated, and as is often an undervalued factor in understanding human affairs, simply have been a grandstanding nitwit. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mueller. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Charles Hecker and Marta Lorimer. Thanks also to Simon Marks at the top of the show. The show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.